The jungle was already breathing darkness when the first sounds drifted up the ridge, branches snapping, metal clinking, voices carried on the night air with a confidence that felt almost unreal. Lieutenant Colonel Mara Edson stood motionless on that strip of coral and kunai grass, listening as 3,000 Japanese soldiers moved through the black wall of vegetation below. His men, barely 800 strong, waited behind him. Many were exhausted to the point of trembling, their uniforms rotting from weeks of rain, their bodies hollowed by malaria and hunger. Yet this line, this narrow rise of ground, was all that stood between the enemy and the airfield that kept every Marine on the island alive. Edson did not promise glory. He did not speak of victory. He simply told them the truth. They had to hold for one more night. If they did, the island and perhaps the entire Guadalcanal campaign might endure. If they failed, the Pacific War could tilt irreversibly in Japan's favor. But why did this single night matter so profoundly? And how did a battered battalion of the United States Marine Corps come to shoulder the fate of a continent-wide conflict? In the summer of 1942, the Pacific War seemed to belong entirely to Japan. In a span of months, their forces had carved a vast empire stretching from the borders of India to the Central Pacific. Hong Kong collapsed in just 17 days. Singapore, advertised for decades as an impregnable fortress of the British Empire, surrendered with 80,000 troops marching into captivity. Across the Dutch East Indies, Burma, the Philippines, and Wake Island, the pattern repeated: swift attacks, collapsing defenses, and a growing belief that Japanese arms were unstoppable. Inside Japanese headquarters, this belief hardened into doctrine. They saw themselves as warriors forged by centuries of tradition, men who drew strength from the Bushido Code and the willingness to die without hesitation. Western soldiers, by contrast, were fatally compromised by comfort, soft, undisciplined, lacking the spiritual steel that Japanese officers considered the essence of combat power. Intelligence reports reinforced the illusion. American Marines on Guadalcanal were portrayed as little more than criminals offered a choice between prison and war. Their numbers were underestimated, their morale dismissed, their training ignored. But the United States Marine Corps was nothing like the enemy imagined. Marine training was among the most rigorous in the American armed forces. 13 weeks of recruit instruction, long hours under the sun, at Paris Island or San Diego, and a doctrine built on a simple truth: every Marine is a rifleman first. Marksmanship was not a slogan. It had been rebuilt from the ground up after the turn of the century, transforming the Corps into an organization where rifle skill was nearly a religion. By 1942, qualification standards required accuracy that would have marked an Army soldier as an expert. Yet for Marines, it was merely the minimum. Beyond that, the Corps had spent nearly a decade preparing for a kind of war no other nation had taken seriously: amphibious assault. Since 1934, they had tested and refined the ideas that would shape the Guadalcanal campaign: coordinated naval gunfire, close air support, landing craft requirements, and infantry tactics against fortified shores. Fleet landing exercises allowed Marines to fail, adjust, and try again, transforming hard lessons into doctrine. They wrote the manual on how to storm defended beaches, and then trained relentlessly to make it real. When the Guadalcanal campaign began in August 1942, these preparations collided with harsh reality. The Marines landed with just 17 days of food and ammunition, expecting naval support that evaporated after the disastrous Battle of Savo Island. The island itself was barely secured. Jungle, disease, and Japanese aircraft from Rabaul pressed them from every direction. The Tokyo Express delivered reinforcements nightly, while American supply lines faltered. Hunger, sickness, and exhaustion spread through the ranks. Yet, amid this adversity, one truth remained: the United States Marine Corps understood how to fight. They were not the broken, undisciplined force Japanese intelligence imagined, but a hardened, tightly trained organization built for the kind of close combat the Pacific War demanded. And the enemy was about to learn that the assumptions made in Tokyo bore little resemblance to what awaited them on the jungled ridges of Guadalcanal. The first real test came long before the Marines took their stand on Edson's Ridge. It arrived on the black sands near the mouth of the Ilu River, misnamed the Tenaru on American maps, where Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki led 917 elite soldiers across a narrow sandbar under the cover of darkness. These were veterans of the China campaigns, men who had known only victory, and believed the Guadalcanal campaign would be no different. Ichiki expected to break the American line in a single blow, shattering what he believed to be a weak and disorganized garrison. But the United States Marine Corps was waiting. Riflemen had registered their sights on likely crossing points during the day. Machine guns covered the sandbar from 3 angles, and barbed wire stretched across the approaches like steel vines in the moonlight. When the Japanese charge emerged from the shadows, bayonets fixed, voices rising in a battle cry they thought irresistible, the Marines opened fire. Tracers slashed through the dark. Automatic weapons tore into the tight formations. The assault collapsed almost instantly. Wave after wave followed, and wave after wave was destroyed. Bodies piled along the narrow sandbar until incoming soldiers had to climb over their own dead. By dawn, the battlefield was quiet except for the rumble of light tanks clearing the coconut groves where survivors hid. More than 800 Japanese soldiers lay dead. American losses numbered just 35. Tokyo dismissed the reports as exaggeration, refusing to believe the ratios. But it was only a prelude to what awaited them on Edson's Ridge. 2 weeks later, Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi brought 3,000 men through the suffocating jungle to strike from the south, choosing an approach far from the beaches where Ichiki had been destroyed. His soldiers hacked through terrain so thick they sometimes advanced only a few hundred yards a day. Exhaustion, malaria, and disease thinned their ranks. Yet they still believed their charging power could overwhelm what they expected to be a fragile American line. They found instead the narrow spine of ground that Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson had chosen as his stand. Raiders and paratroopers dug into the rocky soil, clearing fields of fire through waist-high kunai grass. Artillery coordinates were registered in daylight. The ridge was not elaborate, but it was prepared, shaped by leaders who understood exactly what was coming. When the Japanese bombardment began at 9:30 p.m. on September 12th, the night exploded into flame as shells burst across the hilltop. What followed was one of the most desperate fights of the Pacific War. Japanese troops charged uphill in dense waves, officers leading with drawn swords, enlisted men close behind with rifles and bayonets. Marines fired until their barrels glowed red, then poured water over the metal to keep the guns running. Grenades arced through the darkness. At times the fighting closed to mere feet, the difference between friend and foe determined by silhouette and breath. The center of the line buckled. Paratroopers were nearly overrun. Some attackers reached the edge of Henderson Field itself before being cut down. Through it all, Edson moved along the ridge standing on an ammunition box, rallying men on the brink of collapse. His calm voice, steady even under fire, became the spine of the defense. And as the night deepened, it became clear that the fate of the Guadalcanal campaign rested on men who had not slept, who were sick and starving, but who refused to yield the ground beneath their boots. By 2 in the morning, the ridge was close to breaking. Kawaguchi's troops had torn a gap in the center of the Marine line, pouring toward Henderson Field, the single asset that defined the entire Guadalcanal campaign. Edson had already committed every reserve. Raiders, paratroopers, cooks, clerks, anyone who could carry a rifle were thrown into the breach. Major General Alexander Vandergrift later admitted that this was the only moment during the Pacific War when he believed defeat on Guadalcanal was truly possible. Then, from the darkness behind the ridge, salvation arrived in the form of artillery. The 11th Marines had carefully plotted their fire missions during daylight, knowing the fight might one day reach this ground. Now their 105mm howitzers spoke with a steady, punishing rhythm. Shells detonated across the jungle slopes, shredding the packed Japanese formations that had gathered for a final push. Blast waves hurled bodies through the air. The approach routes became killing grounds lit only by flashes of fire. The Japanese advance stalled, then shattered. By dawn, the full cost of the assault lay exposed in the gray morning light. More than 600 bodies covered the ridge and the ravines below. Some counts rose to 800. Those dragged away by comrades were never tallied. Marine casualties were fewer than 200, with fewer than 60 killed. Kawaguchi withdrew what remained of his brigade into the jungle, where disease and starvation would finish what the Marines had begun. For the first time, the Japanese army confronted a truth it had denied after the Tenaru. The United States Marine Corps would not break. The myth of the irresistible banzai charge, the belief that spiritual force could overcome firepower, had died on this narrow strip of coral. The Japanese expected weakness. Instead, they met disciplined rifle fire, coordinated artillery, and small unit leadership that held a line against 3-to-1 odds in total darkness. The psychological blow was almost greater than the tactical defeat. The months that followed only deepened the shift. In late October, during the battle for Henderson Field, nearly 20,000 Japanese troops struck the marine perimeter in a coordinated assault far more sophisticated than anything attempted before. Battleships shelled the airfield with towering 14-inch shells. Infantry attacked from multiple axes through dense jungle. Yet once again, the American line held. More than 3,500 Japanese soldiers were killed in 3 days. American losses were under 300. The pattern that had begun at the Tenaru and Edson's Ridge repeated itself across the island. By February 1943, Japan evacuated Guadalcanal entirely. They had landed roughly 36,000 troops over 6 months of fighting. Between 20,000 and 30,000 of them were dead, some in battle, others consumed by hunger and disease. American ground forces had lost around 1,600 killed. What vanished with those thousands of lives was not only manpower, but an illusion. The aura of Japanese invincibility, built across the Pacific War's early conquests, had been broken beyond repair. And in its place stood a new reality. The United States Marine Corps, shaped by training, discipline, and the relentless demands of the Guadalcanal campaign, had become the force the Japanese feared most. The shock that followed Guadalcanal rippled far beyond the island itself. For Japan, the defeats at the Tenaru and Edson's Ridge were no longer anomalies, they formed a pattern impossible to ignore. Officers who had once insisted that one Japanese soldier was worth 10 Americans now faced evidence that discipline, firepower, and small unit cohesion mattered more than spiritual fervor. Reports from the front forced Tokyo to confront a sobering reality. The United States Marine Corps was not the brittle force their intelligence had imagined. It was an institution built for sustained, coordinated combat, something the Pacific War would demand in ever greater measure. This realization drove a fundamental shift in Japanese doctrine. The masked banzai charges that had worked in China, Southeast Asia, and the war's early months became suicidal when hurled against American fire discipline. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa's defense of Peleliu and Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi's preparations on Iwo Jima reflected a new strategy, one built around depth, concealment, and attrition. Instead of defending beaches, they withdrew into caves and ridges where artillery and naval gunfire could not easily reach them. Their goal was no longer to throw Marines back into the sea, but to bleed the United States for every acre of volcanic rock. The Americans were evolving as well. Lessons from the Guadalcanal campaign accelerated changes already underway within the United States Marine Corps. The adoption of the fire team, a four-man element built around automatic firepower, reshaped infantry combat. By 1944, Marine squads carried 3 Browning automatic rifles, tripling the automatic weapons available compared to Army formations of the same size. This meant that each squad, the basic engine of ground combat, could suppress, maneuver, and assault with a flexibility unmatched in the Pacific War. It was a tactical innovation refined in the jungle and tested again on the sands of the Battle of Tarawa and the ridges of Peleliu. To the wider world, these adaptations revealed something deeper. The Pacific War was no longer a contest between mythic warrior cultures. It had become a struggle between doctrines, between an empire clinging to the traditions that had carried it through earlier victories, and a nation able to absorb losses, learn quickly, and industrialize its battlefield solutions. Guadalcanal shattered illusions, but it also illuminated the path forward. Every island that followed would bear the signature of those lessons, etched into the fire team formations moving across coral reefs and the defenders waiting for them in the shadows. In the quiet that followed the fighting on Guadalcanal, the true weight of the moment came into focus. The Guadalcanal campaign had not simply halted Japan's advance, it had rewritten the assumptions that shaped the Pacific War. On a narrow ridge overlooking Henderson Field, where the silhouettes of exhausted Marines held firm against overwhelming odds, a new chapter began. Edson's Ridge, later known as Bloody Ridge, became more than a battlefield. It became a statement about endurance, discipline, and the quiet resolve of men who refused to yield, even when the night seemed endless. From the sandbar at the Tenaru to the shattered coral of the Battle of Tarawa, the story repeated itself. The United States Marine Corps proved that training, cohesion, and adaptability could overcome the fiercest assaults and the most deeply entrenched defenses. Each victory carried a terrible cost, yet each also revealed a deeper truth. War is not won by myth or morale alone, but by the willingness to learn, to evolve, and to face fear without flinching. These were lessons purchased in blood, but they shaped every island that followed in the Pacific War. For Japan, Guadalcanal was the moment the illusion cracked. For America, it was the moment the future emerged. And for the world, it stood as a reminder that even small places, forgotten ridges, narrow airstrips, remote jungles, can decide the fate of nations. The Marines who fought there carried scars that lasted a lifetime. Yet their endurance carved out a legacy that extended far beyond 1942. Their actions influenced doctrine, strategy, and the very understanding of what determined victory in modern war. Today, When we reflect on the Guadalcanal campaign and the stand on Edson's Ridge, we are not only recalling a chapter of the Pacific War, we are honoring a moment when ordinary men, pushed past exhaustion, chose to hold the line because no one else could. Their story still asks something of us. What do we learn from their courage, and what responsibilities do we bear in remembering it? If this history speaks to you, and if you value the lessons written by those who fought across the Pacific, we invite you to stay with us as we continue exploring the battles that shaped our world.